Hello, good morning, student. Dear student, today I am going to start your first lesson, The Portrait of a Lady, written by Khushwant Singh. Khushwant Singh is the writer of this lesson. The portrait means chitra se. It is the meaning of the picture of a lady. This is a very best and well story. It is a part of a novel. My grandmother, like everybody's grandmother, was an old woman. She had been told and wrinkled for the 20 years that I had known her. People said that she had once been young and pretty and had even had a husband, but that was hard to believe. My grandfather's portrait hung above the loose fitting mantelpiece in the drawing rooms. He wore a big turban and loose fitting clothes. His long, wild hair covered the best part of his chest, and he looked at least 100 years old. He did not look the sort of person who would have a wife or children. He looked as if he could only have lots and lots of grandchildren. As for my grandmother being young and pretty, the thought was almost revolting. She often told us the games she used to play as a child, or that seemed quite absurd and undignified on her part, and we treated it like the fables of the prophets she used to tell us. My grandmother Khushwant Singh is a narrator of this lesson. He is narrating the story, describing the story about. He is saying that his grandmother, like everybody's grandmother, was an old woman. The grandmother of Khushwant Singh, like others' grandmother, was an old woman. She had been old. His grandmother was old and wrinkled for the 20 years. That old and wrinkled means there are so many lines on the face of his grandmother for 20 years that I had known her. It means Khushwant Singh is saying that he had seen his grandmother as it is for 20 years. There is no change. She was too old. She was so old, and he is seeing her grandmother in the same condition for long 20 years. People said that she had once been young and pretty and had even had a husband. He is saying that people said that her grandmother was pretty, beautiful, and even had a husband. But it was hard for Khushwant Singh to believe about this. About this, his grandmother was beautiful, pretty, and she had an husband. It is very difficult for the writer to believe about this. My grandmother's portrait hung above the mantelpiece. My grandfather's portrait, the picture of Khushwant Singh grandfather portrait was hanging in the mantelpiece. वो लटक रहा था. It was hanging in the mantelpiece and in the drawing room. His grandfather wore a big turban and loose fitting clothes. His grandfather wore a big turban and loose fitting clothes. His long white beard, the beard of his grandfather was long and white, covered the best part of his chest. It means the beard was so long, the chest of his grandfather has been covered by the beard. And He looked at least 100 years old. His grandfather was looking like 100 years old. He did not look the sort of person. His grandfather's portrait was looking like his grandfather was not a sort of person who would have a wife or a children, or he looked as if he could only have lots and lots of grandchildren. His father was looking like so would that his, would have a wife or a children, but lots and lots grandchildren. As for my grandmother being young and pretty, the writer is saying that as for his grandmother being young and pretty, this type of the thought was almost revolting in the mind of the writer of Kushwant Singh. She often, his grandmother often told them of the games and she used to play as she was child. She told the narrator about the games in which she played in her childhood, or that seemed quite absurd and undignified to her part. We treated it like the fables. Fable is the meaning of the fables. It means small stories, old stories, small and old stories, and prophets. Prophets means you can say who give the message of the God. It is Pagambar. It is called Pagambar. Treated like the fables of the prophets. She used it tell she used to tell us about the small and old stories like the prophets tell about it. She had always been short and fat. Now the narrator Khushwant Singh is describing the structure of her of his grandmother. He is saying that his grandmother was short, she was fat and slight bent. His grandmother was short. His grandmother was fat and slightly bent. Her face was crisscross of wrinkle. There were so many wrinkles on the face of grandmother from everywhere to everywhere. On we were certain she had always been as we had. She had always been as we had known her. Old, she was so old, so terrible old. The narrator saying that his grandmother was so terrible old that she could not have grown older. It means she was too old that she could not grown more old and had stayed at the same age. It was thinking that the narrator was thinking that it was feeling his grandmother stayed at the same age for 20 years. It means for 20 years the narrator is looking her grandmother as it is in the same condition. She could never have been pretty, but narrator did not see her grandmother so pretty, but she was always beautiful. He is saying that his grandmother always was beautiful. She hovered about the houses in spotless white. It means she cleaned the house spotless white with one hand resting on her waist. She put her she put her hand on her waist, resting on her waist to make the balance of herself, stoop and other telling the beads of her rosary, and grandmother always counted the counted the beads of the rosary and always murmur in her mind, in her own by her mouth regularly the prayer. Her silver locks were scattered. It means the hair of the grandmother were scattered entirely on her pale face, puckered face, and her lips constantly, the lips of grandmother constantly moved to unaudible prayers. Yes, she was beautiful. Again, the narrator is saying that, the writer is saying that his grandmother was beautiful. She was like the winter landscape. Here, the poet is comparing the face of his grandmother with the winter landscape in the mountains. He is comparing the face of his grandmother. Grandmother was so beautiful, which was looking like the landscape of the mountain in the winter seasons, an expanse of pure white serenity and breathing peace and contentment on the face of his grandmother. Dear student, listen this video carefully. Try your best to understand of the story. Thank you.